Hey, it's Tom from Toons. You've got to check this out. In this video, I'm going to show you how to install this dash panel from Pontoon Stuff on the standard Helm. If you're shopping for consoles, gauge panels, steering wheels, furniture, flooring at PontoonStuff.com, use Tom's Toons at checkout to save 5%, saves you some cash, and it helps our channel out. I've got my standard console right here, and I've got my instructions from PontoonStuff.com for the installation of my panel. I'm going to go ahead and take these back 2 pages right off, because these together will line up and correspond to what I need to cut out for everything to fit in. So first things first, I'm going to cut on this solid outside line. And then I also need to cut out along here, and then I can tape it on so I can trace it on with a Sharpie. I feel like I'm back in 4th grade in art class, and I'm going to get downgraded if I can't cut right on the line. With my stencil cut out, I'm going to basically just try to line up in relation to, there's a slight curve to the console, so I'm going to line up that top corner so there's a little space, and that'll leave me a little space on the bottom, but it's a pretty tight fit here. And I'm going to put a little bit of just blue painter's tape to hold this in place while I trace it on. We'll do the same to the right side. And make sure the bottom lines up. Looks good. Ooh, it's time for a new Sharpie. It's all about having the right tools. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just trace on the inside of my cutout. So I'm just going to roughly fill in where that tape was so I can continue my cut semi-accurately. And we're going to cut these out. I'm running a multi-surface cutting bit on my Dremel tool. If you got to buy one Dremel tool in your life, buy the plug-in. Because if you ever need to keep going, you need more juice to get through thicker material, who knows, you will be grateful that you got the plug-in. The battery power is probably great for odds and ends stuff, but even cutting out an entire panel worth of boat, or panel worth of console on a boat, you're going to want the plug-in. So I just use one hand to guide it and the other hand to hold on tight, because it'll try to run on you if you're not careful. But we're just going to go ahead and I'm going to cut just on the line or just inside of it. I can always take a little more off if I need to. My dentist says I clench my teeth too much. She thinks I grind them at night, but it's totally when I'm running power tools. And we're going to get this up on the boat and ready to start installing steering, the electrical, everything. Let's look at our panel. We cut out our holes in the dash. We'll show you that. I had to modify it just a little bit, but I'll show you in a second of actually where the cutout went. But let's look at the dash itself. So this is going to fit on that face of the console. This is the carbon fiber option. It's also available in burl wood. But what we have on here is a tachometer, a depth finder, and that actually comes with a transducer kit. And we're not going to go into depth on installing that, but it is actually just plug and play in terms of it's already got power, and you just plug the transducer in right here, and it's ready to operate as a depth finder. On this particular panel, I'm going to swap that out for a fuel gauge. We have videos on fuel gauge installation, so you can look at that if you need to. But in this case, I'm not going to go into great detail on it, but I am getting rid of the depth finder, going to a fuel gauge. It fits in that same 2-inch cutout. And this boat is getting a fish finder, which is going to give depth, temperature, and hopefully show some big fish too. I think it's going to be pretty common. If you're restoring a pontoon boat that has a permanent fuel tank and you want to have a gauge, this is a great place to put one. You could cut another one in too. We have a volt gauge and we have a GPS speedometer. Moving on from the gauges, we have a couple of chargers, so USB and USB-C chargers. And then we've got our switch panel. We've got all of our switches starting from the right going to the left. We have a horn, navigation and anchor lights, and then a whole bunch of accessory lights all the way across. So you have the option of adding 6 12-volt accessories onto this, but we're already wired in to do our navigation and horn. We are going to be using the Pontoon Stuff harness, the accessory harness. I say it in every video I talk about it, but it is a really great tool when you're restoring a pontoon to get fresh electrical, and it's plug and play, meaning I'm going to take my pigtail, it's got a plug with a fuse, you've got your hardware for securing the faceplate. I can unhook that, just unplug it, and now just omit these wires. I can plug right into the accessory harness, and now my navigation lights, my horn, those are already pre-wired to go run out into the accessory harness, out to the accessories you hook them up to. I don't want you to freak out. I'm going to turn this around, and I think a lot of you are going to get anxious if you don't love boat wiring, but that's what I'm here for, and I'm going to try to do my best to make this as simple as possible for you so that you feel confident installing it on your boat. Take a deep breath. There's a lot of stuff happening back here, but we're going to talk through it.
Cavitation.
Forget all this right now. We're going to work through one thing at a time. This is my plug-in to my accessory harness. On this plug, we've got a red wire, big red wire, and a big black wire. Those essentially bring a positive and a ground or negative from the battery to our switches. Then all of these wires coming back out, we have a gray with a black stripe. That's for my docking lights. It corresponds to your harness, that accessory harness from Pontoon Stuff. I have a gray with a green stripe. That's my navigation lights on the bow. I have a gray with a blue stripe. That's my stern light or my anchor light up on the bimini. And then I have a brown with an orange stripe. That would be another accessory or a bilge pump or live well pump. But you could use that for lights or anything. Those wires go out onto the harness and they have grounds associated, so you can just splice in other accessories. Lights, bilge pumps, whatever you want. Remember, when I'm talking about those colored wires and the plug-in to the switch panel, I'm talking about where those wires go in relation to the accessory harness from PontoonStuff.com out to your navigation lights, horn, all of those accessories, but we're talking about the harness that plugs into the switch panel. Ignore all of the switches for now. I'm just going to talk about what we have access to wire-wise. So coming out, we have an orange with a white stripe and a ground wire, a black wire. So the orange with the white stripe is a power, a positive. The black is a ground. This is for a horn if you wanted to run your horn under the console. There's also a wire out of your main harness to wire a horn in the front of the boat. You could do either or. We're going to get rid of that. And actually, there's just a couple of female spade terminals on those. I'm just going to wrap this up and tape it off and get it out of there because I'm going to run the horn up on the front of the boat. I have two other, these are simply accessory options. I have an orange power wire and a black ground wire. I can tie these into, in this case, I'm going to tie them into undersea LEDs and a fish finder. I could tie them into my stereo. I'm going to connect my positive and ground to the respective positive and grounds coming from accessories. So I have two of those, and if we chase those around, we can see where they're located, where those switches are. So if we follow our orange wires, solid orange, I have one coming into this switch right here, and then the other one actually runs all the way across to this first switch right here. So those are pre-wired, ready to use for your accessories. The other switches I have, this is my horn switch on the end here with those orange with white stripes. These are my navigation lights and the second switch coming in. So that has my gray with a green and gray with a blue coming out for power. This third switch right now has the brown with an orange stripe running out of it. So the power going out to the live well or bilge pump is this third switch in. And then we have our docking lights pre-wired into this fourth switch in. So that has the gray with a black stripe running down. If I wanted to, and I probably will, I can unplug this gray with a black stripe. And I'm gonna unplug that brown with an orange stripe. And I'm gonna move this gray with a black stripe to that third switch. So I'm just where I unplugged the brown with an orange, I'm just gonna push my gray with a black stripe on. So now I have horn, navigation, docking lights. And then if you look down in here, we have a free post right here at the end of my finger. That's a free male spade terminal. I could hook that brown with an orange stripe up to that. I'm gonna leave it open because I can hook any positive wire to that, and then I just have to run my ground, find a shared ground on the switch panel. I could tie it into any of these other grounds. I could piggyback it. I could run a ground to a bus bar under the console. Not gonna go into huge detail there, but I could use this fourth switch now for anything. Or I could even move my orange wire over to it, but we've got lots of options there. On this other side, same thing. Essentially what I have on the other side of the steering wheel, I have that, remember that orange wire accessory came in here, so I can use that, just plugging into the wires provided. And then I have two more switches that have positive outposts readily available. So again, I could tie a ground in to these shared grounds to jump across. I could piggyback in, use a piggyback splice, or I could tie into the very end over here and I could splice in a ground, sharing the ground as it comes across. So lots of options there, lots of room for accessories, which is the cool thing about this panel. Now let's talk gauges. If you're running this just straight out of the stock from the factory, if you want to say, you're not going to change any gauges. This big gray cord, it's got a GPS puck. And I was told you can just stick this under the console and it will still read for your GPS speedometer. Really nice there. It's accurate. It's not like the old speedometer that is super inaccurate. That is a thing of the past. We're going with GPS now. This is all pre-wired for power to these gauges. So we have a couple options here. If you have a gauge harness coming off of your controls, these wires are provided. We have a purple, which would be a positive or a power. We have a black, which is a ground, and then this gray wire is a sending unit or sending wire for your tachometer. So sending wire for the tach. So that's gonna send the signal from the motor to the tach. If you don't have a ignition harness that has a gauge harness, you may omit this, or you might go find yourself a tach harness and run it for your motor. On that note, in the instructions, we have a tachometer chart that's going to tell you the pull setting to set your tachometer to. So when I look over at my tachometer, I have my pulse setting, pull setting. I'm going to find my motor on this list. The motor that's going on this is a brand new 60 horsepower 4-stroke. I can find Mercury Mariner on the list. I run down all other 4-strokes. Is a 12 pull. We're gonna be on 6P setting on the back of my tachometer. That's this little pull setting here. And it's set right now to 3 pulls. I'm gonna change it by pushing in slightly and turning it to that 6P setting. Now my tachometer will read accurately coming from my engine. So the way that this works is this purple wire is powered through your key-on power. If you have a Mercury or an Evinrude, you're gonna have that corresponding colored wire. There are wire charts or colored wire charts in the instructions to tell you which wire to hook this up to on your ignition harness. And the same with the ground is gonna hook to your ignition harness as well to give power to these gauges so that they work. Here is our voltage gauge. You don't have to do anything on the rest of these gauges other than just plug into our depth finder. So really neat, they've done the wiring for you. All you need to do is plug in that purple, black, and gray to your ignition harness. to power our gauges. When we get set to install this into the dash, one big thing to remember is this is how it comes. Everything's plugged in together. You're gonna need to unplug these, and you can only plug in one way, so you can't goof it up. We unplug those because half are gonna go on one side of the console and half are gonna go on the other, and then they'll reconnect once everything's installed. I'm gonna go ahead and get this configured the way I want my switches. I'm gonna swap out my fish finder for my fuel gauge, and then we'll hop up on the boat. I'll show you how I changed the cuts in the cutout so that these gauges would fit. I essentially just had to make a little bit more room on the insides of the top cutouts just for these top gauges to fit in better. I'll take care of that, and then we'll hop up on the boat. So I removed the depth finder. It's a positive and ground, and then that connection to plug in your transducer. When you disconnect that, you're gonna have to pull the power and ground off from your tachometer. So there's just a couple locking nuts. Keep those, because if you're doing this, I'm not gonna go into great detail, but if you're swapping out, this is a Sierra brand. It's a Lido, L-I-D-O is the line with the chrome bezel. That's the gauge that this is. And on the back of this fuel gauge, which I'm swapping out for because we have a fish finder up on the console, you're gonna have 3 posts. You're gonna have an I, which is ignition, or you could consider this key on power, or however you're powering your gauges. So I'm gonna jump a wire, this purple wire, this post here that has a purple wire attached from my tachometer. I'll jump a power from there over to the I post. I have a G, which is my ground. I'll jump my ground, that black wire post on my tachometer, over to the ground post here on the fuel gauge. And then I will also jump a power where I can steal the light. There's a bluish wire. I can steal that power from there over to this. It'll be just a female spade will slide onto this post here, and that will supply the backlight for my gauge when everything's powered up. Your last post on the fuel is an S. It's a signal. That's where your fuel signal wire is going to go. So when you run from your fuel tank, this happens to be a brand new tank. There's a red and a black. A lot of times it's going to be pink and black. The pink or red would be your sending wire, the signal wire. That's going to go, the pink or red will go to the S post, signal or sending wire post. And then your ground from your tank, the black wire, is going to go ahead and stack on top of that ground post on the fuel gauge. Hope that makes sense. We've got in-depth videos on how to wire a fuel gauge and wiring a whole fuel system or setting up a whole fuel system. This is going to fit right in that same gauge hole, so I'm going to go ahead and install this and then run my wiring so we can go get this up on the boat and start putting everything together. If you are swapping out the depth gauge for a fuel gauge, which I've done here, you could screenshot this. I'll walk through it real quick. But what I did is I took my key on power coming in, this purple wire, on that same post. I ran a purple wire across to power, that's on the I post on the fuel gauge. My ground, I did the same thing. There's a ground wire here, comes around, ties into the ground of the fuel gauge. And my sending wire is a 2-in-1 here, but I've got my red wire is gonna go out to my signal wire, my sending wire, and then there's a ground that goes to the tank as well. Those are both, the ground is tied with the ground coming from the tack, and then these run out and I will splice them in. I label everything before I take it up on the boat, splice that into my fuel wire. So that is that. We're gonna go up. The only other thing I did do on the other side where everything comes in for the gauges, I did take off those bullet terminals and put on butt splices. I'm gonna splice these into that harness that came from Mercury. Let's get up and put this together. We're up on the boat. This is where I had to cut in just a little bit to make room for those gauge mounting brackets to fit in. So what I'm gonna do is take my panel here. We got a whole bunch of wires coming off of it. But what I need to do is just make sure that this group of wires goes through my top right hole. There's a couple wires for my fuel gauge and my hookup for my gauges that's gonna hook up once I get it into the dash. I gotta make sure that goes through its own hole, and then same for the bottom wires. So we'll start at the bottom, get all those going through, and then we can line up the top after. just feeding everything through, because remember, some of these are going to hook up on the other side, on the back side of the console. If you had an extra set of hands, definitely be easier here, just to guide things in. Not so bad. That's all in there, so I'm ready now. I can go ahead and run my screws to tighten that in. The other option, you could absolutely pull everything through the console, hook it up, and go, but honestly, I think this is going to be the easiest way to just install this completely. I've got everything in front of me here, and then go around to the back side, which I'm going to show you in a second. Because we have such a nice big opening, all my wires are going to be hanging down there anyway, so I can hook everything up. I'm going to get this installed, just a set of stainless screws to go around. We'll make sure the fit up is nice. It is a curved surface, so you do have to pay attention to that. I would say your best bet is going to be to run all of your top, then your middle, then your bottom, to pull that into position so it stretches nicely over the curve of the console. And that hardware was supplied in the packaging. And going with a plastic plate into the rotomolded plastic, I'm just going to get it just where it snugs up. You won't even hear my impact do its thing. I'm just going to get it in there snug, and that's going to be plenty tight. As soon as I start to see the gauge panel flex, that's enough. When I do these side holes, I'm going to push the bottom down to follow the curve and then run my screw in. Also be careful, obviously if this slips off, I could put a nice gouge in my brand new panel, and we don't want that either. So I'm being pretty gentle with it. Now that that's all actually screwed in, when you put that carbon fiber wheel on, ends up really, really sharp. This is gonna look really nice, really sporty look when we get everything mounted up. Let's go to the back side, and I'm gonna show you how I hook everything up there. I'm trying to give you the best view possible into what I'm working on here. You'll see I did install, this is a brand new steering system, and you can see I've got it tipped up. That way I avoid all of my switches and all my wires. That's one way. There's actually room to finagle the, is that a word? Your steering cable in to have it run so it's out of the way. But I'm gonna go ahead and just pull all my wires that are coming from my switches and switch panel right on to have access. And let's start by plugging in the parts of the panels that need to plug into each other. So we've got that bottom, power, ground, and then I've also got my gauges. So you can only plug them in one way. Ran that up behind the steering so there's less tension on it. And you'll see in this, I did get rid of one of these orange wires you'll have in your kit. You'll have an orange wire that connects, and I just omitted that from the opposite side of the panel, and I used that orange wire on the right hand side when you're looking at the panel. Not to go into super duper detail, but you could totally plug and play and run this. The other thing I did is I used piggyback splices. We have those in our wiring kit, and that allowed me, so for instance on this stereo, I label everything so I know where to hook it up to, but on that switch I was able to run the 16 gauge. I've got a power wire and then a ground wire, and I used the piggyback female spade terminal to slide onto the ground post, and then I piggyback the ground wire that was on the switch panel already. I could use the piggyback splice to put those together. So now I have a power and a ground, because remember on 12 volt direct current, gotta have a power, gotta have a ground, somehow feeding back to the positive and negative or power and ground post on the battery. You could definitely do a negative bus block as well, but in this case, everything's right there, and I had the terminals, the connectors, so why not just direct wire right into that switch panel? It was quick and easy, and I didn't have to invest in a bus block. If that's your thing, go for it. This is gonna work just fine as well. I gotta start splicing some stuff in here. I've got my stereo. I'm gonna go ahead and wire the power and ground for my stereo into my power and ground here. Got my stereo power in. Now I'm gonna run my fish finder. So I've got a lead, a positive and a negative for that as well. And I've got a little inline fuse and a power and a ground for my fish finder. For my 2 orange and black accessory leads coming off, so solid orange, solid black, that's a positive and a ground for each of those switches. What I'm going to do is put those into my front and rear interior lights. I've wired these up through the bottom of the boat, and I've got a little excess, but this is the wire for my front LED underseat lights. So we're going to tie that into this solid orange with a solid black for my switch. What's really nice about this switch panel and harness combo is they do give you this easy to plug in accessory wire, so you can run other accessories like that. You could run the stereo to this if you wanted. I wired in my own extra accessory wires off the positives and ground of the switches, but this is set up ready to go for you. Just splice right in. And then my rear LED lights, I'm going to wire into that other orange for positive, black, ground. We're now ready to move on to the gauges. So what I've got here, this is going to a new 60 horsepower Mercury, but what it is it's a plug-in for a gauge harness. So I have a gauge harness that comes out, and on the end I find a black ground wire, a purple key-on power wire that's going to supply power to the gauges, and that gray tack wire. These have a ring terminal on them because they're actually made to just go directly to the gauge. However, our gauge harness here is pre-wired. Our whole gauges are pre-wired. So I'm just going to go ahead and cut these ring terminals off and use those heat shrink butt splices to go to the corresponding purple, black, and gray wires. Remember, if you're doing different, maybe it's a Suzuki or Yamaha, you are going to have different colored wires that correspond differently. So your purple might be yellow or red. You got to pay attention to that. And the nice thing is, in the instructions, there's an entire chart in there that will line things up for you. We'll get these spliced in. Follow that chart if you've got a different outboard. So if you have a Yamaha, Suzuki, Tohatsu, there's different colored wires that'll correspond differently for your power and your tack sending wire. The ground is almost always, or at least as far as I've ever seen, always black. The other thing that I have to hook up, I wired my fuel sending wire. Red is my signal wire and the black is ground. So I'm going to go ahead and tie that into the wires that I ran down from that fuel gauge that I opted to go with. And remember, I'm only tying in a sending wire and a ground here because power to my fuel gauge is supplied from those other gauges. We jumped across from the tachometer, if you remember, and we piggybacked in for the backlight as well from that tachometer. You do not want to ever hook power to the sending post of your fuel gauge. You'll probably just ruin your fuel gauge if you do that. And with everything else hooked up, I'm going to connect my harness here to my gauge panel, switch panel here. That supplies power and makes all those connections. I've got everything spliced in. This is a mess right now, but all I need to do is tie things up. I use electrical tape and zip ties to tie things up nice and tidy. Bundle them up. If you've got a ton of excess wire, we can just add a couple curls to them and we can tie them. If you're going to tie them to things, make sure it's something sturdy like your steering cable. If you're going to zip tie it to that, that way you're not pulling a bunch of weight on a wire connection. Let's go see how everything turned out. Here we are at the dash. If we work from this side, we've got our horn. We've got our navigation lights. So if I push that forward, that's going to be my front, my green and red lights, and my stern light. At the same time, if I push just this one, only my anchor light behind me on the bimini is going to be on. We've got 3 more switches here, so this is going to be my docking lights. You look up front. On these 2 switches here, I've got my rear LEDs and then my front LEDs for under the seats. This is a cool little accent feature. Acts as a courtesy light too, a little safer for night when you're on and off the boat. And then we jump over to this side. This switch here is going to give power to my fish finder. So that turns on, and that way when I'm done using the boat, fishing, whatever, I can just turn this switch off and it kills power. So as long as all my switches are off, nothing's taking power. This switch here is going to turn my stereo on. Mounted that on the side. Nowadays with Bluetooth stereos, honestly, it's not usually the captain who's supplying the music. So this way it's on the side of the console. Anybody can walk up, connect their phone and use it. I can turn the power off here and that will kill it, but then I'll still turn the switch off. If I turn the switch off, now when I turn the switch back on, it's gonna automatically power up the stereo. So you can let the stereo remember if it was on or off. And now the stereo will just turn on automatically with that switch. If I don't want it to, I just have to manually hold this down and turn it off. So I ran this last switch, and we show it in other videos. I ran it to power up these chargers. So there's little indicator lights, which is actually really neat. I'd turn my indicator lights off with these little switches, but this way I can just have that switch go ahead and make sure that power is off at the end of the day, because if this is closed up, I might not see that those lights are on and I might drain my battery down. It's going to take a long time, but it could still drain down. So now turn that off and no power is going to that USB and USB-C chargers. The last thing to look at here is our key on power. So from my key switch down here, when I hit that key on power, it's going to power up those gauges. There is indeed no fuel in my fuel tank. And then TAC, volt gauge, could use a little charge on the battery. And then that GPS speedometer as well as the hour gauge. That is all working properly. When we turn the key on, the gauges are supplied power. That's how it should be. Another neat thing that I was able to do with the standard console, a lot of people ask, will a binnacle or a topside control box like this fit on the console? And typically it can be done, but not with this gauge panel. What I was able to do was use the Deluxe Helm rigging box and install my controls here so I have room. And what's neat about this setup, this is I think about a $50 add-on to this console. I was able to run my ignition harness and key switch to the main console and my gauge harness, and I'm still able to run my neutral safety and trim harness back to the controls. They're that close together. Something really cool to think about when you're doing this setup. That's it for installing this switch and gauge panel from PontoonStuff.com on the smaller console. Thank you for watching.